I'm going to start the record here. All right, so thanks so much for everyone coming out tonight. This is really exciting for me. I, of course, am a huge fan of Zen habits myself, and so it's great to be able to connect with you guys and to answer some questions about a topic that is so near and dear to my heart, which is how to find your passion. And, it took me a long time to do it for myself, so I understand how hard it is and how when you don't have a framework and a system to use, the whole process is agonizing. So I really wanted to help people do that. As you know, I did a guest post on Zen habits, and in that guest post, I talked a little bit about what I called the fire in the belly. Actually, my dad called it the fire in the belly. And somebody had pointed out to me that they're like, well, that's great. We need to know how to do that, but it's a little tricky. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to walk you through sort of 5 shortcuts that I think will help you a lot in doing that, and then we'll take some questions. And before we get started, I just wanted to clarify, I saw in the chat questions, somebody wanted to know how I got $1 million a year. What Leo was saying is that I walked away from $1 million. So I left the Air Force 4 years short of retirement. So I gave up $1 million to do what I'm doing today, not necessarily make it. Okay, so now that that's clear, let's talk about how to find those passions. And the first question that usually comes up is my passion a career or is it a hobby, and how would I know the difference? This is really important because, of course, the first place we normally start when we're looking for those passions is in our hobbies, and that makes sense. But there's not always a direct correlation. So what I like to tell people is that you need to find a correlation between those things that you love to do and whether or not they can meet your definition of success. And of course, to do that, you need to understand how to define success. Right? So basically, I define success with 3 pieces: your core values, whether or not it makes you feel proud of yourself, not necessarily making others proud of you, but whether it makes you proud of yourself, and whether or not it speaks to both your intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So if you haven't heard those terms before, intrinsic motivation is where you're motivated to do something simply for the process itself, right? So a lot of people, I would say, call fishing an intrinsic motivation. It doesn't matter if they catch a fish, but the process of fishing is enjoyable. Extrinsic motivators are things where you're interested in the outcome. And a lot of us, when we have set up a career, have focused on those extrinsic motivators instead of the intrinsic motivators. Okay, so 3 things. Core values, you need to understand what your core values are and then make sure your work aligns to those. Self-pride and motivation. And the reason that this starts to get a little tricky is that simply enjoying something, if you have a hobby that you really enjoy, doesn't mean it's going to line up with your definition of success. So I'm going to give you an example, which I'm sure I'm going to pay for later. So my husband, as you might imagine, gets all sorts of free career advice, whether he wants it or not. And one of the things that he was asking me about is he said, well, I'm trying to find my passion, right? And one of the things he loves to do, given some spare time, is play video games. And he said, so does that mean I should, be looking for a career in the video game industry? And when we went back to that definition of success, I said, I don't think that that is a good place for you because it doesn't have that self-pride. In fact, it's just the opposite, right? Because he's actually somewhat embarrassed to tell anyone that he even plays video games, much less wants to go work in the industry. So I actually see this a lot. In fact, there was a person who was watching the videos for the No Regrets Career Academy who said, I really want to go off and be a ski instructor, but again, I would be embarrassed to tell people that that's what I did. And, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you can get over it, that's great. But if you can't, if you just have a real block there, then it's going to be very hard to be satisfied and to feel successful in a career that doesn't bring you that self-pride, doesn't have the motivation that you need to keep going, and doesn't align with your core values. Okay? So that's step number one in trying to decide between is this a career or is this a hobby? Now, step two is looking at what I call your anti-passions. So everybody wants to focus on what they like to do, but you also really have to focus on what you hate doing. And this is so important. This is a big thing that people miss, and it's where a lot of people go astray. So when you want to take something, right, that is maybe a hobby for you right now and turn it into a career, usually you don't get to do that one activity anymore in isolation, right? So for example, if let's suppose you're an artist and you really like to paint. Now you say, all right, well, I love this. I'm going to make it my career. I'm going to be an artist. But in order to make that a career, now you need to make money from it. And that's probably going to involve a lot of marketing and sales, which someone who's an artist may not enjoy. So it may invoke a lot of time with something that would be an anti-passion for them, instead of allowing them to focus on the thing that they really love to do. So if when you try to take this passion and turn it into a career, and you find that it really involves too many of your anti-passions, that might be another good indicator that you really want to keep it as a hobby instead of your career focus. That's not to say you can't get creative, but in general, if you have too many anti-passions during your day, even if it's allowing you to do what you love to do, that's going to start to weigh you down. The other issue is that passion isn't the only consideration. It's certainly a big one, but the other things that you have to consider along with that definition of success is whether or not your personality and your strengths align with your passion. So for example, as a scientist, you have to do a lot of detail work. In fact, it's what a lot of people don't understand about actually performing science experiments is that it's pretty dull. You're going into the lab, you're having to do a lot of repetition, doing things, the same experiment over and over, collecting data. So if your personality type, for example, my personality type is an INTJ on the Myers-Briggs. I'm a big picture person, I'm an idea person. And I hated going into the lab and having to do all of these, very detailed experiments. That was very hard for my personality. So when you're evaluating whether or not your passion is a good fit as a career, you also need to evaluate whether it fits with your personality type and whether you have the aptitude for it. And aptitudes or strengths are interesting because they're not an absolute. That is, if you don't have a particular strength, so let's suppose that I want to be an artist, but I don't have very good depth perception, so I'm not very good at creating three-dimensional objects and seeing them inside my head, which is true, I don't. I can overcome that, right? If I have enough passion for it, I can overcome that deficiency as an aptitude because I'll be willing to put in the time to develop that skill. So you're also looking at a balance here between passion, personality, and strengths. So I tell people to pull those three concepts together to really evaluate what careers might be best suited for them. All right, so what is, in my opinion, the number one mistake that people make when they're looking at this idea of passion? And that is they don't get specific enough. And the reason I say this is because it's really easy to say, for example, I want to be a scientist, right? But or I'm really interested in science, really is how that would come out as a passion piece. I love science, I want to do science. But doing science could mean a whole bunch of different things, right? I could be a science teacher, I could be a researcher, I could be a science writer, I could go on and on and on, and I could craft a whole bunch of different careers around a passion in science. So when you're going through this and you're trying to figure out how a passion translates into a career, you really need to continue narrowing down. And the way I tell people to do that is to basically keep iterating through that definition of success, right? So looking at your core values, your self-pride, your motivators, and that intersection between your personality, your passion, and your strengths. And you keep iterating through that until you can narrow down what makes the best sense on those different factors. So the way this plays out, for example, I had a friend who told me she was going to head back to school. She was going to get a graduate degree in archaeology. And I said, well, that's interesting. What made you decide to get a graduate degree in archaeology? And she said, well, my whole life, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist and go out on digs. And I said, wow, that's really cool. Have you ever been out on a dig? And there was sort of this silence on the other side of the phone. And she said, well, no, not exactly. Actually, I don't want to go on digs. That's not what I want to do. I want to work in a museum. And that was when I realized that she hadn't really thought through what her interest was and what she wanted to do with it. I mean, she certainly had an interest in history. She had an interest in working with other people, probably, this desire to be in the museum, but she hadn't quite figured out or fleshed out what this passion looked like. And so I just cannot emphasize enough that you need to spend some time really imagining what it is you want to be doing within this broader scope of the term passion. And when you do that, then we sometimes get to the final piece, which is, do I have to choose among my passions? So a lot of times we feel like we're narrowing down, and ideally what you'd like to do is to take maybe 2 or 3 passions and put them together. And that was, for me, the huge aha moment. I mean, when I went through my own journey, for example, I had writer as one option, I had teacher as another option, I had entrepreneur as a different option. And I was evaluating all of those separately, along with other options as well. And for me, the big aha moment that finally came, I mean, really relatively late in my whole journey, was that I didn't have to evaluate those separately. I could be a teacher and a writer and an entrepreneur. And that was really the sweet spot that allowed me to feel like, wow, this is it. This was what I wanted to do with my life. This is what I was meant to do. And this is how I can make the biggest difference. So another issue is when we talk about passion, we often are talking about fulfilling ourselves. But I believe that when you get to that real sweet spot, you're going to find that it's also about making a difference and having an impact in the world. And that'll take you back to that definition of success. Exactly, what do you mean by making a difference or having an impact? But in my opinion, it's the right job for you will allow you to meet that criteria of making a difference and having an impact. And it's a wonderful feeling when you get to that point. Science, I think, is great. I enjoy science. I actually have a tattoo of DNA. Okay, so clearly I enjoy science. But for me, it just wasn't meaningful enough. I didn't really feel like I was doing anything with it. I was kind of going through the motions. And I know you probably have had that feeling too, where it's not bad work. I always tell people the worst job you can have is an okay job. And that was where I was. I had great bosses. Everybody liked what I was doing. I was successful at it from a traditional standpoint. But I didn't feel personally successful because I didn't meet that criteria of making a difference. Okay, so that I went kind of through all of that rather quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions, and then I know you guys are going to want to ask Leo questions as well. So I'll go ahead and take whatever questions you have.